Hi, and welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. Today we have Gib Hedstrom. Gib has been in this space for a long time. He started with Arthur D. Little in the early 80s, working on EH&S, and went and spent some time in Belgium and became the corporate sustainability co-leader for Arthur D. Little. Went on, and this is where I met him, was at the conference board where he was a ESG Council leader, program director for many years, and gained a lot of great connections in that space and a lot of great insight. He then went on and opened his own consulting, Hedstrom Associates, and lately has created a tool called the ESG Navigator, which is super interesting and making really good impact for the companies that are using it. So great conversation. I really like his insights, and I think you'll get a lot out of this. So with no further ado, I give you Gib Hedstrom. Gib, thanks for joining us.
Delighted to be here, Jeff.
Well, first of all, it's been a long time. Great to see you, and great to hear of the success of ESG Navigator and all your work. You've been in this space for a long time.
No, I just say hard to believe. I think I've shared with you that I was at COP 0 back, what are we up to, COP 27 or 28 now? And the original Rio Earth Summit was in 1992 when I started learning about climate change. And here we are.
Here we are. We have arrived in some ways, for better or worse, which is really where I want to start our conversation. Given the broad kind of, trajectory you've taken in this space from 0 now to 28 or 29, tell me, what are the three things you think corporate responsibility, sustainability, ESG, whatever you want to call it, executives need to be thinking about today?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jeff. And these are not necessarily in any particular order, but I think point number one is how to make sense of the business news over, especially about the last 8 months with all the ESG bashing that has taken place from the state's attorney general and BlackRock and all of the rest. Executives have been getting it from all angles, and how do they distill all of that and make sense? Point number two is to actually understand and be clear about what ESG is and what it is not. I think there's a lot of kind of simplistic agreement that ESG is E plus S plus G, but especially on the G part, a huge amount of confusion, oversimplification, the rest. And that kind of leads into the third point, which is what is most important for company execs to focus on to drive value from ESG going forward. And I just finished a survey with Scott too of Train Technologies on leading ESG indicators that I'll be happy to share the results of, but basically kind of clarified where 160 companies think the most important areas of focus are to drive value. So those would be the three kind of key points.
I love that. So we've got ESG backlash. What is ESG? And, what are the material elements?
Yeah, where's the value?
Yeah. So let's start with what is ESG. I mean, I think this is a particularly important issue because what's happening right now is everybody wants to jump on, ESG has kind of made the cut now. It's above the fold.
Made the cut.
Yep. Everybody's like, oh, ESG. And you've got teams now within companies, their sustainability reports are now ESG reports, whether or not they're investor focused or not. So it's important to kind of bring us back to the two definitions of 2004, 2005 of the genesis of the conversation and then how it's being used today. So tell us from your view.
Yeah, definitionally, sustainability back when the term was coined by good friend John Elkington with the triple bottom line, and in the 90s, Shell and others, was the triple bottom line, people, planet, profits. And the big problem recognized in the late 90s was, what about governance? What about the way we actually run the company? And then in 2005, along comes ESG, and that's great because G became kind of front and center. But the big question I would ask is, what happened to profits, right? What happened to how we actually view our business through a sustainability lens to drive tomorrow's growth? And so the view I've always had of sustainability and ESG is all of that. People plus planet plus profits plus governance. And as you know, I reported to many boards back in the 90s through my EHS auditing work at Arthur D. Little. And in the late 90s, I was asked by boards about sustainability. And they said, how do we think about it? How do we stack up? And where's the value? And that launched the development of what today is ESG Navigator. And it's simply built around governance, strategy, environment, social, or people, planet, profits, governance. And so that's kind of the whole picture. And it turns out that about 60% of the KPIs within ESG broadly are governance and strategy, and about 40% are E&S. And that's quite different than the way many companies tend to spend their time.
I think that's all right. I mean, ESG as a concept was born from the report when I was at the United Nations Global Compact. Georg Kell and Gavin Power teamed up and produced a report called Who Cares Wins. And it was this whole concept of environmental, social, and governance are material issues to shareholders and investors of all shapes and sizes. And you saw Bloomberg and others pick that up, and they said we need about 10 years to run these data, in these models to see that it, holds water. They did, and here we are, 15 years later. Now, almost exactly what they said was going to happen happened. Now they're showing that actually these are material issues, which blends into the second point you make on what's the value. The problem I see in the space, though, right now is that all these companies, including privately held companies that don't have investors, have renamed their teams ESG teams. And so I kind of think we have this, just like we had in uppercase sustainability and lowercase sustainability. Now we have uppercase ESG and lowercase ESG. But it gets to this idea of like, where is the value creation element for society and for the business?
Yeah, and by the way, that at a meeting of the conference board's two sustainability councils, that one of which you were part of years ago, and I used to run in North Carolina a month ago, this was a key topic, very candid discussion among 50 members of Council 1, 30 members of Council 2, all around this terminology thing. And should we be using ESG, and should we be using sustainability, and how do we navigate all of that? And I think the bottom line out of that is ESG is not going away. Sustainability is not going away. What matters is the content that you're conveying in terms of what your business is and where your business is going, not just a label you put on it. In terms of where's the value, it was really interesting. I'm sitting on data from about 140 companies who confidentially put their self-assessment into ESG Navigator on how they stack up on these 100 KPIs, 60% governance and strategy, 40% E&S. And they assess not only where they stand, but what's most important to drive value. And we supplemented that with a survey of another 50 or so companies and thought leaders, people like you who have been in this field a long time. So data from about 160 or 70 companies on what's most important in ESG. And the results of that, to address your question on where the value is, were really twofold. One, absolute agreement on the E and the S part, the what I would refer to as the what. What are the issues that are critical to our business? On the E part, all about carbon, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, carbon impact of products, et cetera. On the S part, all around DEI and workplace. Yes, community is important. Yes, supply chain is important. But the crux of the issues were around human capital, attracting and retaining and training with a very, very diverse workforce and leadership. So those are the table stakes, the E and the S. The other dominant result of the data from these companies is you got to lead with governance. It's all about, we have all these KPIs around governance, and those are the ones that companies said were by far and away most important, which is the how, right? The what are the issues, the E and the S. The how is how are we going to create value? And so just double clicking on that how, the sub themes under that were number one, purpose. How do we truly integrate ESG into not just the words on our annual report, but the way we live our purpose day in and day out as a company, Number two, operationalizing. How do we literally integrate ESG into the fabric of running the company? And three, culture. So within the governance, how those three kind of subsets of purpose, operationalizing, and culture were the things that companies were saying, this is most important to us. So as they are setting their goals of where to focus, those are the things they said are most important.
I think that is amazingly helpful because so much of the governance conversation that happens in this space is CEO pay and do we have a sustainability committee that, as part of the board, which I think are not immaterial questions to ask, but they are, one of 40 or two of 40. And the more important ones are the ones that how do we drive this into the culture, operations, and ethos of the company?
Exactly, Jeff. And so I said 60% of the 100 KPIs are governance. Yeah, call it 40, rough numbers. Of those 40, CEO compensation is one, board DEI is one, and there's a handful of others where the outside raters can grab onto information, right? Where there's concrete information, board committee, like you said. But a lot of those 40 KPIs are soft, right? Board agendas, time in board meetings, interaction with customers, investment in innovation, scenario planning, strategic planning. There might be a little bit of information on those that companies disclose, but a lot of it's internal and confidential.
Yeah, I think, and I get why people go to these other issues because they're more tangible. You can report on them and they can serve in some ways as a canary in the coal mine. And I think that's great. But they are a leading indicator, not the end result in and of themselves, I would argue.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So where does this leave us? We've got, what is this? What's the value? And now we've got ESG backlash, the politicization, if this were a movie, here we are, the dramatic third act is coming.
The third act is coming. Yeah, and I think it started, as I've said to you, I only read the business news, Wall Street Journal, Fortune Business Week, all the typical news journals that a C-suite executive would read, none of the greens or kind of social stuff, pure. And starting about last August was when the state's attorney in the Wall Street Journal, and by the way, the Wall Street Journal editorial page is kind of my monitor, which has obviously always been very, very right of center, even right of the Wall Street Journal. Occasionally, they would publish an editorial by Fred Krupp of VDF or somebody, but for the most part, not believing in climate change, among other things. And so starting last August, half-page editorials bashing ESG, and then it continued, right, for the next 8 months, and it continues today. My take out of that is twofold. Number one, buried in the complaints about ESG are some very valid points. The fact that financial institutions are offering ESG products that are all over the map with no criteria, no official criteria of what qualifies as a sustainable fund or whatever, absolutely valid. The fact that raters and rankers are kind of all over the map on this stuff and that it's almost impossible to correlate what the raters say with reality. There's a great article called the ESG Mirage. I think it was in Bloomberg Business Week. Looked at the MSCI ratings of McDonald's, did not even include climate impacts, for example. And so the point one is that a lot of the complaints are valid. But the much more significant point, I think, is that all of this attention, all of this bashing only serves to validate and reinforce the magnitude, scale, and timing of ESG being mainstream. And I think for any exec to think that ESG is flawed or we've hit a big pause button would be a mistake. And the smart companies are just accelerating their progress towards their net zero and other goals. They're not hitting the pause button at all. And so I think stand back from all of that stuff. I think BlackRock lost something like $4 billion with when a few Oklahoma and a few other states pulled money out. And during the same period, they made $300 billion of increased inflows. There was some article that said roughly that kind of magnitude. So like you said, I put my money on BlackRock and others of that ilk. They may have had some stumbling blocks, but that's where the future is.
It's certainly not perfect, and we've known this. I wonder if it's not equivalent in some ways to when Porter came out with the article on shared value and said, listen, 80% of GRI is overbaked. Like there's really the material issues to your company are some small subset of those 80 KPIs. Figure out what they are and run for them. Yeah,
exactly.
And we didn't have the world didn't go crazy when and in fact that was welcomed. So I do think you're right. I think it's a good point to take. I had a boss who used to say, "Eat the fish and leave the bones," which I think is a good one.
Right. Yeah, the raiders and the investors would be wise to do that. The bone is correct, but they little flaws in some of the execution.
Yeah, it doesn't mean there's not any fish there.
I don't think Larry Fink is backing off, right? I think he came out and acknowledged, and I talked to board members who have met with Larry Fink through one of the conference board meetings that was 3 or 4 years ago. A CSO, senior VP of a company, had met with Fink, and kind of one-on-one, and he's not backing away from this. This is very deeply held. But companies struggle, right? So he says purpose is important. And this is the results of the survey we did. So purpose is important and integrating ESG is important. Almost every company can say, yeah, we looked at our purpose. It kind of provides for long-term value creation with value to society, blah, blah, blah. So we got that nailed. So is that okay or not? I think the fundamental question, and by the way, this has got to tease up a conversation Scott, Tu, and I are going to have with Corporate Eco Forum, a group of about 60 CSOs in a month or so, is ESG Navigator is a maturity scale from, kind of starting to accelerating to leading to transforming. And a lot of companies have figured out the critical areas they need to be leading. And a question that I would ask is that good enough? For given the scale of climate change and the scale of the transformation globally that's needed to decarbonize society, is being a leading company good enough? And where exactly do we need to completely kind of transform our business? And I think that's kind of the $64,000 question for a lot of companies.
I couldn't agree more, and that'll have to be the subject for a follow-up discussion, because I think, you said it perfectly there. Like, we're leading on this. Are we transforming? Is Tesla a green company or not a green company? That's one you see in the news all the time right now. Well, they created an EV revolution, and we have to give them credit in all cases. Like, there's no doubt about it. Whether or not they're being run in a air quotes responsible manner, like that's a secondary question, and maybe as relevant. Yeah,
and it is a subject of a future conversation. But I think Tesla's such a great example, because they went beyond transforming. That's the definition of transforming in the core business purpose and placing their bets.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot of baggage that hangs off of that, right?
That's
that
right.
They made that transformational. And if Tesla were doing an honest self-assessment with ESG Navigator, they would be way off at stage 4, which is the top, transforming on a bunch of things. But they would also be stage 1 or 1.5 or maybe even 0.5 on probably some of the others if they were candid. And that may be okay, right? That's the trick, is where does a company need to be stage 3 or 4 to drive future value? And you don't want to be stage 3 or 4 on everything, because that costs money and investment.
That's right. It's fundamentally about what is the role of business in society. And what we can't say is the role of business in society is to cure all ailments. That's not fair.
Right.
Right. No. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. And it sounds like we've got plenty to talk about again in the future. So thanks for joining us, Gib.
Thanks for the opportunity, and always great.
Yep. Great to see you.